Everyone ready? Now we have recording. I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Alameda County Board of Directors, November 26th. Secretary, call the roll, please.
Directors Huang,
Here.
Sethy,
Here.
Weed,
Here.
Akbari, here, and Gunther.
Here. And this evening, I'll lead the salute to the flag.
Right.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Okay. Hey, public comments.
Yeah, and if you'd like, I can
Housekeeping first.
just share some quick notes about housekeeping remarks. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the ACWD Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome the public's participation in this special meeting of the ACWD Board of Directors. My name is Ed Stevenson, and I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this board meeting in person or remotely by either using the Zoom application or by telephone. Any member of the public participating in person may approach the speaker's podium at the appropriate time. For those participating remotely, note that the meeting agenda and all related materials are available on the district's website at acwd.org. You may reference the instructions at the top of the agenda for how to participate using the controls in the Zoom app or your dial pad if participating by telephone audio. This hybrid board meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public for future viewing. Again, thank you all for attending, and President Gunther, that completes my housekeeping remarks.
Okay. Housekeeping over. We'll look at public comments on matters on this notice of special meeting. No, well, Mr. Marshak. Mr. Marshak.
I do see Bob Marshak on line, and I don't see a hand up, though.
Okay. And we will move on then, as there's no members of the public in the room. Let's open up the financial workshop. Excuse me. For calendar year 2024.
Okay, thank you, President Gunther. Yeah, it's a momentous meeting here. We've got a lot of work to do. This is the fourth in a series of financial workshops scheduled for calendar year 2024. The first workshop focused on the district's budget. The second workshop focused on the district's current and projected financial status and consideration of tiered rates for single-family residential customers. The third workshop focused on the allocation between fixed and variable charges, water shortage emergency stage rates, evaluation of creating multiple customer classes, and various customer service and billing policies. This workshop is the fourth financial workshop of 2024. And the third of three scheduled workshops that will focus on the district's current and projected future financial status, water rates and charges, rate structures, including tiered rates for single-family residential customers, the allocation between fixed and variable charges, water shortage emergency stage rates that could be charged during a water shortage emergency, such as a drought, and the use of the property tax roll for billing the service charge, collecting on delinquent accounts, and other customer service policies. So, as the third of three scheduled workshops, our objective tonight is to receive final board direction on all of these topics so that staff can do the heavy lifting to prepare for a December board meeting, at which time we hope to receive final direction from the board on the needed Proposition 218 notice. So with that, I will turn it over to our Director of Finance and Administration, Mr. Wunderlich, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Good afternoon, members of the board, staff, and public. If I could ask for the presentation for today's workshop to be brought up. So first, by way of introduction, Rick Simonson, who you've become familiar with from HF&H, is unable to be with us today. And so Gabe Sasser, who's a project manager at HF&H and who's been engaged in all aspects of the district's project with them, although you have not seen him here in the room in the prior workshops, is here, and he'll be presenting tonight on behalf of HF&H when we get to that point of the presentation. All right, next slide. So we've got a full agenda, and we want to get through a number of topics, including reviewing what's been accomplished to date, and then reviewing a number of topics, including our approach to debt and treasury management, the rate increase percentage, reviewing additional information on the concept of multiple customer classes with uniform rates, as well as a recap of tiered rates options and the next steps. And to get more specific in terms of what Mr. Stevenson alluded to, we've had a number of decisions made already. What we're really hoping to get direction on tonight is the level of increase or rate increase percentage that the board would like to pursue in consideration of the options that are presented and the relative trade-offs. And then the second one is really whether we maintain our current uniform rate structure as it exists today, whether we set up a different uniform rate structure, or whether we move toward tiered rates for single-family residential. And so we'll be looking for board guidance on that topic. And those are really the two major outstanding topics. All right, next slide. So this is the schedule we've been through. We had first the budget workshop, and then we're now in July and August, previous rate setting workshops. We're here today for the third workshop. And then we would be looking to get that direction from the board and come back at the December 12th, 2024 regular board meeting for the board to consider setting a date for a public hearing and then authorizing the issuance of a Prop 218 notice. Next slide. And this is just a recap of the specific guidance we're looking for tonight. I would say that the approach to debt or treasury management does not have the same sense of scheduling urgency, perhaps, as the other items, but it is relevant information given that we're looking to use debt more frequently in the next 5 years or so. But again, board guidance on all these topics today is what we're looking for. Next slide. Okay, so to just quickly recap in July, what we heard in July was that there's not an interest in deferring capital projects or in minimizing San Francisco purchases, which means increasing water hardness. We did here in July comfort with the other kind of financial planning assumptions, including the additional capital projects as were reviewed from the engineering report. As well as feedback that we should prepare a variety of additional options to discuss, which we did in August or are doing tonight. Next slide. So in August, we received a number of items of key feedback and direction. One was to maintain the same ratio between the service and commodity charge revenue recovery, maintaining the current approach to stage rates. We received direction to augment delinquency collections on the property tax bill to include owner-occupied, individually metered multifamily accounts. And then we also were asked to bring some additional data back about landscape customers and the concept of different uniform rates for different customer classes. And so we are here today with that additional information. And then we were also asked to investigate billing the service charge on the property tax bill for non-residential accounts. We are not presenting that tonight. That will be separate from the rate setting process, but there will be a future presentation, I'd say within the next few months on that topic. Slide. Okay, so next slide. And what we really wanted to kind of emphasize here is that we're making some changes in our general approach to the use of debt. That doesn't mean that those changes are inconsistent with established district policy. We just wanted to highlight that for the board. And so I'll cover a few things, and then we'll turn it over to Darren Hodge, our financial advisor from PFM, to talk through some of the options. And so when we talk about our planning horizon for rate setting, we always look at the current year plus the next 5 years. And so that's a kind of a 6 fiscal year horizon. And if you look at over the last 6 years, we issued debt once. We took out 10 million of new bonds and refinanced the 2012 bonds. That's the only debt issuance we've done within the last 6 years. So if you look at over the next 6 years, depending on the direction provided by the board today and how things proceed as we go through this process, we're looking at issuing bonds 3 times, anywhere from 140 to 160 million. So under any scenario that's being discussed tonight, you can see that's definitely a change from what's been done in the past 6 years. Next slide. And so, again, that's not to say it's inconsistent with established policy. In fact, I think it's still, any of these approaches are still very much consistent with our established debt management and disclosure policy. It includes a number of key factors that would favor pay-go financing, such as we have enough money to pay cash for the projects now, and realistically, we don't have the cash to pay for all the projects we need to do over the next 5 or 6 years. Or another consideration would be that the additional debt would put us in a really bad situation in terms of meeting our existing debt covenants. And that's not an issue either with any of the options being presented today. And then, factors that would favor debt financing is that we've got plenty of revenues to cover the debt service. It wouldn't affect our existing debt or overly constrain our finances. Also, in terms of, intergenerational equity, are we building assets that will have useful lives at least as long or even significantly longer than the term of debt repayment? And so we would also want to maintain a coverage ratio of at least 2.0. That's in our debt management and disclosure policy. I think the lowest ratio that we'd be looking at having, even under the scenario that issues the most debt, is still over 3. So we're still going to be above that 2.0. All right, next slide. And then, our current approach is that we do pay mostly pay as we go. And that does mean, as we've seen in recent years, that we're accumulating capital reserves to pay for larger projects. And that approach can require higher rate increases near term as needed to generate the cash for projects, but does provide more flexibility and potentially lower rate increases long term because you're not paying those debt service payments. The proposed approach would be a combination. I think we'll show some data as we get into it. Even with the maximum amount of debt contemplated, we're still paying for more than half of our CIP with available cash, right? So it's still a combination of debt and pay as you go. But by introducing that debt component, you do control the accumulation of capital reserves because you're not necessarily looking to save in advance for large projects. Rather, you're issuing debt to pay for those projects. And near term, the rate increases do not need to be as significant, but it does provide less flexibility long term, as well as potentially higher costs long term because you're paying interest on the debt. All right, next slide. And so at this point, we'll turn it over to Darren Hodge from PFM, and he's going to be focused largely on kind of interim financing methods that we would want to think about in kind of this new configuration where we're issuing debt more frequently. So I'll turn it over to you, Darren.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone. If we could turn to the first slide, what I'd like to begin with is just a very quick overview of the plan of finance for 2025-26. Next slide, please. So in terms of 2025's financing needs, as discussed at the prior workshop, we anticipate selling bonds in the spring of 2025. The amount of that bond sale is still TBD. It's something that we will be analyzing and determining closer to that time. That transaction is expected to be traditional tax-exempt long-term fixed-rate bonds, similar to what the district has issued in the past. The other element to the plan of finance for the next 2 years that we are contemplating considering is the development of an interim financing program, really to support the delivery of our long-term capital improvement program. What we'll talk about tonight is the three traditional forms that interim financing has taken and that some of your peers have utilized. And in terms of the timing of when we would like to have this interim financing program in place, we'd like to target that late next year around December of 2025. So if we turn to the next slide, what are the benefits and why would we be looking at interim financing? Really, interim financing allows us to be more efficient in managing our borrowing needs. As Jonathan mentioned, the district is contemplating a combination of PAYGO as well as debt to fund its capital improvement program. If you don't have an interim financing program, if you're issuing debt, you're doing so in one of two ways. You're either issuing debt in anticipation of project expenditures, or you're issuing debt to reimburse prior expenditures that you've made. Now, each of those has their advantages, their pros and their cons, but one of the things that an interim financing program can allow you to do is be very efficient in how you're funding those capital costs that you're anticipating issuing debt for. And what you can essentially do is use an interim financing program where you issue or draw upon the interim financing program on periodic basis, typically smaller amounts, with the idea that after that interim financing program has accumulated up to a large enough amount, you will then issue long-term bonds to repay the interim financing program and convert those capital costs to long-term debt in accordance with your plan. Interim financing, as we'll discuss, typically it's issued in one of three forms, almost all of which are issued with short-term rates. So you're really accessing the short end of the yield curve prior to the time at which you take it out with long-term bonds. That, as we'll talk about as well, there are considerations with this. Interim financing does subject the district to certain risks that just issuing long-term debt in anticipation of borrowing or reimbursement may not have. But as part of our recommendation, as part of the analysis that we'll be performing, we will monitor and take into account those risks to make sure that they're appropriate for the district. So if we can turn 2 slides, what I'd like to talk about next is go into a little bit more detail on the 3 most prevalent forms of interim financing. So the first form of interim financing that we see quite a bit in the market is an LOC-backed commercial paper. And I know on the right here, we say LOC, letter of credit. So we'll talk more about what the letter of credit actually means with regards to commercial paper here. The second is a revolving line of credit, which is very similar to the district's existing facility, just a little bit larger and used for different purposes. And the last is short-term notes. Next slide. So on this slide, what I'm going to be talking more about is the mechanics of a commercial paper program. So commercial paper is a publicly traded security, and as a publicly traded security, it requires an offering memorandum, which is very similar to the preliminary official statement and the official statement that we issue with our long-term bonds. In addition, commercial paper will require ratings as well as QSIPs. The way that we structure commercial paper programs is typically we will go out and request a maximum size of the program. So in this case, let's just assume it's $100 million just for discussion purposes. What this means is that we can issue commercial paper up to a not to exceed amount of $100 million. But it doesn't mean that we have to issue $100 million. We issue commercial paper on an as needed basis. So you have flexibility to only issue what you need, and therefore you're only paying interest on the commercial paper for what you've issued. So in that way, it's a much more cost-effective form of financing than some of the alternatives. Commercial paper is issued with a final maturity of not to exceed 270 days. So often what we'll do is when we need to issue commercial paper, we have a commercial paper dealer, which is a broker dealer and an investment bank, and we'll have a call with that investment bank and say, we need to issue $5 million of commercial paper. What is the maturity that you feel gives us the best rate? And then we'll talk about what's different maturity ranges for this commercial paper issuance. Is 30, 60, 90, 180 days? What gets us the best rate? And then at the maturity of that commercial paper, the district does one of two things. We either roll it, meaning we simply remarket that principal for another maturity up to 270 days, or we pay it off, either with cash or with long-term debt. One of the key elements of a commercial paper program is that it's sold with a letter of credit. What a letter of credit does is it provides liquidity and protects against a failed remarketing for investors. And the reason that that's so important is because you have money market funds are big buyers of commercial paper, and they need the utmost in security for purposes of being able to invest in that. And so for this reason, because we have a letter of credit, oftentimes commercial paper trades based off the rating of the letter of credit bank rather than the rating of the district. We'll talk more about letters of credit in just a minute, so I'm not going to go into too much more detail just yet on those. But if we turn to the next slide, what I want to talk about now is a revolving line of credit. So contrasting this versus commercial paper, remember commercial paper was a publicly traded security. A revolving line of credit is not typically a publicly traded security. It's more just of a bank loan agreement. So we would go to a bank and say, in our prior example, we would like $100 million line of credit. And then if the bank agrees, we will determine terms and conditions, and then we will have access to up to $100 million that we can request the bank provide us on an as-needed basis. The benefit of a revolving line of credit, very similar to commercial paper, you're only going to draw what you need. And so therefore, for the most part, you're only paying interest on what you've drawn. With one caveat, there is a minimum commitment fee. So in our example where we have a $100 million line of credit, you would still pay some minimum amount just to maintain access to that capacity. In this example, we said it would be 20 basis points. So there is a minimum fee on the undrawn amounts, but the larger fee, the draw fee, that's only based off what you've drawn when you actually make that draw. The other key difference here is that with commercial paper, whereas it's based off market rates in terms of what are investors willing to purchase your commercial paper at, typically lines of credit are set, the rate on each draw is set by a formula. And oftentimes it'll be a formula based off SOFR, which is a taxable short-term rate, and it will include a spread. What we've seen recently is that given the corporate tax rate, banks are usually willing to offer 80% of SOFR plus some sort of a fixed spread. And we've seen that fixed spread range, depending on ratings, anywhere from 30 to 55 basis points most of the time. But that spread, that 50 basis points, that's what you really compare against the different banks that you're requesting facilities from. And it's really based off your credit and your credit ratings in large part. One key difference with commercial paper, a revolving line of credit does not require a letter of credit. And that's because there are not investors to put bonds back to the district. You're simply asking the bank for a draw on a line of credit. They say, yes, you have your money. There's no need for a letter of credit. We can move on to the next slide. Or Jonathan, do you want me to pause periodically to see if there's any questions or just keep proceeding forward?
I think maybe we get through the third item and then we can pause for questions.
Perfect. Okay. So if we turn to the next slide, I'd like to talk about short-term notes. So this is our third option for interim financing. Short-term notes, similar to commercial paper, are typically a publicly traded security. So they will require a preliminary official statement, ratings, and a QSIP, similar to the bonds that we've issued. The key difference with a short-term note is that whereas commercial paper and revolving lines of credit are typically a variable interest rate that resets periodically over time, when we sell short-term notes, for the most part, we're selling them with a fixed interest rate. So when we issue these notes, we know the interest rate for the life of the obligation. And typically, we issue these notes with a life of anywhere between 2 to 5 years, but it's really based off what's the maturity that works for us, what do we desire, what's the rate associated with that maturity. Now, at maturity, these notes can be either rolled, i.e. we issue new notes to pay off the notes and extend the maturity, or we pay them off with long-term bonds or with cash. The interest rate, because we're negotiating a public sale with investors, very similar to bonds, we're negotiating a rate with investors at which they're willing to buy our bonds. The one difference here is that when we issue notes, it's not a drawdown program. So with commercial paper and with a revolving line of credit, we borrowed and issued those on an as-needed basis. Typically with short-term notes, we're issuing the larger amount all at once. And so there's a little bit less efficiency from the standpoint of we're paying interest on the entire amount of the short-term notes from day one, not just the proceeds that we've actually expended. So on slide 10, moving to the next slide, this is where we're going to just compare some of the key characteristics of these three options. So as we've kind of talked about, we have the two options we've talked about, commercial paper and the revolving line of credit. The interest rate on these is more of a variable rate. It resets periodically. The bond anticipation notes or the fixed rate notes, those are issued with a fixed interest rate that's set at the time of sale, and it's constant through the maturity of those obligations. In terms of the cost, each one of these options will have an interest rate cost associated with it, but they'll have different ongoing fees associated with them. So with a commercial paper program, we have two additional fees in addition to our interest rate. We have to have a commercial paper dealer, which is an investment bank, and so we will pay them a CP dealer fee. In addition, because we have a letter of credit bank, there's a fee that's paid to that bank to provide that letter of credit. And again, that's a fixed fee that's paid on the total amount of our commercial paper program, regardless of whether we've issued anything on it or not. In addition, there are certain one-time setup costs because we have to create an offering memorandum, we have to get ratings, there's costs associated with that. Contrast that versus the revolving line of credit, where we have an interest fee, but we don't have a commercial paper dealer because we just have a line of credit directly with a bank, so we save on that. And also there's no letter of credit bank, so there's no letter of credit fee. However, there is a commitment fee that we have to pay the bank, which is essentially a fee to the bank to make sure that we maintain the access to the capacity to draw under that line of credit. In addition, there's also one-time setup costs. They're not as much as commercial paper because typically you don't need ratings, nor do you have an offering memorandum with a revolving line of credit, so our upfront costs are lower. Now with the bond anticipation note or a fixed rate note, we have our interest cost. That is our sole cost going forward. It's just the amount we pay on interest. But up front, similar to commercial paper, we do have costs associated with disclosure, ratings, underwriters, etc. So we do have greater upfront costs than a revolving line of credit and slightly higher than commercial paper. In terms of the liquidity facility, a liquidity facility is only required on a commercial paper program. Now on the maturity, the commercial paper, we issue that for up to 270 days. Revolving line of credit, typically when we talk about a maturity, really what we're talking about is how long is that program outstanding for? How long does the bank give us access to this line of credit? Typically that's anywhere from 1 to 5 years. With a commercial paper program, the program itself stays out for longer, but the letter of credit associated with that program is very similar to a line of credit. It expires every 1 to 5 years. In terms of call flexibility, these are all pretty flexible. I'd say letter of credit, it's callable on each maturity date of the commercial paper, so between 1 to 270 days. On a revolving line of credit, we negotiate prepayment terms into the documents, and typically they're fairly flexible. With the bond anticipation notes, the call provisions are a little bit less flexible because investors want some sort of a guarantee or certainty of return. And so to the extent that we incorporate more prepayment flexibility, it increases our cost of borrowing. Want to turn to the next slide real quick and just highlight, again, we've talked about the major documents required, but you can kind of see the differences here. And they almost correspond to the upfront costs that we incur with each of these three options. So for a commercial paper program, we have an offering document, we have a marketing agreement with the CP dealer, we also have an agreement with the letter of credit bank. With a revolving line of credit, we simply have a loan agreement with the bank that we're securing that facility with. And similar on notes to commercial paper, with notes, we have an offering document as well as a note purchase agreement that we enter into with the underwriter of those notes. Before we pause for questions, turn to the next slide and just go through the pros and the cons of each of these, just in high level, generally as we see it. So with regards to a letter of credit backed commercial paper program, the benefits that we see to this program, it's a proven market structure. There are a lot of commercial paper programs that are active in the market. They provide a very flexible way to meet our capital expenditure needs, and it's a cost-effective way from an interest standpoint because we're only paying interest on what we've drawn. In addition, because it's such a mature and proven market structure, there's a lot of investors that are active in this market. And so when we go out to sell commercial paper, we really try to set terms and provisions to attract the widest universe of investors to try and get the lowest interest rate. And I'd say right now, in terms of the interest rate, commercial paper you know, compared to the other two, right now at least, is probably the lowest cost amongst these three options that we're looking at today. Now, the considerations with a letter of credit backed commercial paper program is one, it requires a bank facility, which means that every 1 to 5 years, we have to go out and either extend that letter of credit or secure a new one. And there can be costs associated with that. In addition, there's administration and monitoring roles. So every time we issue commercial paper, that's a new role that we monitor and track. Now our trustee will assist us with that. So the administrative burden, we try to minimize that, but it is an additional administrative item we have to take into account. In addition, versus a revolving line of credit, because we have to get ratings, because we have to have an offering memorandum, the initial setup costs are higher than the next option that we'll talk about. So on a revolving line of credit, the benefits of this, there is no letter of credit. So we don't have to go through the renewal of this every 1 to 5 years. We don't have the cost associated with a bank letter of credit. We don't have exposure to a letter of credit bank like we do with commercial paper. Similar to commercial paper, however, you do have flexible draws, which reduces your interest rate expenses. So we're only paying interest on what we've drawn. In addition, we don't need ratings. We don't have a remarketing agent. And for the most part, we don't have any offering memorandum. In terms of disclosure, really all we're having to do on a periodic basis is send the bank financial information. We try to limit that annually to the ACFR that we provide them. The considerations with the revolving line of credit is that because you're negotiating directly with a bank, the terms and covenants can differ from facility to facility. They're more of a negotiation with the bank. So whereas a commercial paper, you can kind of create these terms and conditions that are a little bit more flexible in terms of working for you. A line of credit is more a straight negotiation with the bank. In addition, you might find that depending on how large of a facility we're looking for, you might run into situations where a single bank may not be able to accommodate the entirety of the line of credit that you're asking for. Where we see this is anything over 50 million. There's a lot of banks that can provide that, but there's a few banks that drop off that can only provide up to 50. But, you know, in general, for what I think we're probably looking at, I don't see this as a huge concern. Now, when we talk about notes, the benefits of a note, you know, it's a proven market structure. It reduces our future interest rate risk because when we issue these notes, the interest rate does not change for the life of them. So that's a benefit. We also don't have any commercial bank exposure. There is no letter of credit. There's no remarketing agent, etc. The considerations are that there's an upfront cost to this. So ratings are required. We have to develop a preliminary official statement, an official statement. Those are all time and costs that are incurred to us. In addition, I think probably the most prominent consideration with a note is that it's not a flexible draw schedule. Typically, when we do notes, we will issue the amount of notes representing the full amount that we want to borrow over a period of time. And you're paying interest on an entire amount from day one. And so it's less efficient versus a commercial paper program and a revolving line of credit from that perspective. And I would say right now, fixed rate notes are more expensive than a commercial paper program, but less expensive than a line of credit, at least in today's market. So with that, Jonathan, we're going to go into kind of some terms on the letter of credit, but is this where you want to pause and get questions?
Yeah, I think now would be a good time to pause and see if there are any, questions or comments from the board or public.
Want me to lead off? So, thank you for the presentation. I am generally familiar with these different types of securities that are issued, financing options. I would like to ask Mr. Wunderlich a question. When we obtained a line of credit several years back, that was to create a backstop for us for in case we were in a major earthquake or emergency and we had to draw up to, I think, $50 million or something. Is that a revolving line of credit or just a line of credit for that specific need?
It's a line of credit just for a declared emergency. And so that's why we can't use it for just general financing of the capital program because it's restricted to an emergency declared by the governor. And so now what we're talking about is needing some sort of credit or interim financing just in general for our capital program, regardless of whether there's an emergency.
That's what I thought it was. And didn't we have like an option to draw 10 million right away and then a much larger amount later on?
Yeah, so that's set up as a $10 million line of credit, and we pay the same type of commitment fee on that for the undrawn amount as Mr. Hodge has been talking about for that revolving line of credit. But we have the ability in discussing with our partner, JP Morgan, who that line of credit is with, to quickly increase the size of that should it be needed, should the disaster warrant making something larger.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I'll just make one comment. With the moves by the Federal Reserve last week, it looks like we're entering a period where interest rates will be coming down. And so my first option, because of the rollover periods, would preferably be go for a commercial paper. But I'd like to explore what it takes to maintain a revolving line of credit at the same time. That's it.
Thank you. As we look at the various options, it's important to look at what the money's being spent on and what the lifespan of the improvement, et cetera. So not to take debt that would be in line with the service life of the improvement. Lines of credit work great with the soft costs of starting up a project, the environmental, et cetera, because there's nothing physical at the end, and you're going to basically pay that out of hide. The line of credit we currently have on the reserves for our catastrophic situations had an accordion clause where we had $10 million. We were paying full bore per carrying costs, but less on the, I understand, on the next 40 million. And those rates have adjusted over time, and we were able to get the banks into competition. So it started off as 15 basis points in order to get our business, and now has migrated up to about 40 basis points plus.
Yeah, something between 40 or 50 basis points. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I just want to be clear. The line of credit we have right now with JP Morgan, I don't believe it provides us with kind of a unilateral authority to just increase it. That would still have to be negotiated with them. But, you know, with them as our regular banking partner and the discussions we've had over the years, we have, you know, a high degree of confidence that the existing terms could be applied to a larger line of credit should that be needed.
And we could set up a separate revolving line of credit with them.
Yes, we could.
Yeah, San Francisco, when they did their their water supply improvement program, was I believe used about $600 million to initially start their project using commercial paper, and then went into, once they started building things, went into more secure financing. So I support the approach that's here, and would note that we expect about a 3-year or more slide in interest rates. So the longer we can put off longer term debt, the better off we are.
Well, that's what I was just saying.
Thank you.
So I actually wanted to see if staff or members of finance committee had particular recommendations between the three options. Obviously, I'm a little bit more familiar with the bond anticipation notes and the line of credit, but it sounds from the presentation like the LOC-backed commercial paper is probably the best route for us, or at least the most flexible route for us. But I'm curious if staff has a particular recommendation of the options ahead.
Yeah, so we don't have one specific item. I think, you know, for this evening, we're mostly we're just trying to get the board comfortable with the fact that we're going to need to have a different structure with our treasury management coming up these next 5 to 6 years and what those options could be. Most likely, we'd be looking at a letter of credit backed commercial paper or a direct purchase revolving line of credit. Those are most likely we'd be looking at one of those two options. And the big difference between those two and the bond anticipation notes is with the bond anticipation notes, you're paying interest on the full amount you're issuing from day one. And so even though you might have more upfront costs with some of the other things, you're paying less interest. And which of those two would be most advantageous for the district will depend on market conditions at the time. And so it's something about a year from now, again, pending the exact schedule of large expenditures in the capital program and other, kind of financial performance of the district. But probably about a year from now is when we'd be looking, very seriously at choosing between the two.
I point out that WIFIA, if we be so fortunate as to be able to qualify, would allow us to pay on the debt that the monies that we receive in that timely manner. Thank you.
I think if the objective was to get the board more comfortable with different financing options, then I'm certainly there. I think there's a very reasonable argument to be made. Consider different options than we've used before. So I'm definitely open.
Yeah, we don't, again, because this is more than a year away, we don't need to make a specific decision on this tonight, but if there is board feedback or preferences, that is useful for us to know as we continue with our planning.
Just thank you for the presentation and the contrast between the three different options. I think, as you said, by the time when we need the money, let's take another look, maybe in another year. And at that point, we'll understand a little bit more about the rates and which one will work out better for us, depends on our need, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for the presentation. It actually really helps, but I look forward to our discussion about a year from now.
Well, several of my questions have already been answered, and actually my knowledge level has considerably gone up. I do support what we're trying to do. Particularly with the amount of money we are talking about trying to bond out, 140, 160, whatever. If we could do it in this direction, we certainly could save, I think, a considerable amount. So I'm all for it, and we'll hold, wait staff's recommendations in the near future, or say a year out.
Yeah, and really what this allows us to do is, instead of having to save money up for a big project, what we can do is when we have those big expenditures come in, we can immediately put them onto this interim financing. And then the other side of it too is we can delay issuing the long-term bonds until we're just kind of refunding this interim borrowing. And, Mr. Stevenson could tell you all about when we've issued bonds in the past. Sometimes if the timing of that does not line up perfectly with the expenditures on the capital program, then it creates perhaps undesirable incentives with just trying to spend a lot of money very quickly, within like a 3-year period. And so these types of things give us, a lot more flexibility in managing cash flow and creates less, I'll say, external financial pressures on project managers to try to adhere to financial deadlines rather than, what makes the most sense for projects.
If I can add a little perspective here. As far as I know, the district has never issued these type of credit facilities in the past. And the reason I find this encouraging that we're looking at it is from a consumer ratepayer point of view, that the more efficiently we can manage our cash and steer away from pay as you go, as we've traditionally been doing, I feel that this helps to lower the rate increases on people year to year. And we're talking about major projects right now that can last well beyond the 30-year bond financing period, well into the future, maybe 50 or more years. And so I feel it's only fair that future citizens in our community share in the current costs of what are going to be beneficial, what's going to be beneficial well into the future, that the benefits they're going to derive. So I think this helps to spread out the cost over generations, and it helps to minimize the rate increases in the near term. That's my thought.
If I could throw one more thought out, which is almost like beating a dead horse. If we're going to direct funds for capital improvements, I would hope we'd find a mechanism by which the service cost, the fixed fee, is used to pay for those, not the commodity cost in income, which is highly variable.
I think this has brought us pretty much to the conclusion of this section of the presentation. Mr. Hodge, did you have any other items you wanted to cover? You feel like you've heard what you need to?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very well presented.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate y'all's time.
And I don't know if we covered this last time, but Mr. Hodge is located in Arizona, which is why we've invited him to join us remotely back in July and again today.
Pretty cool.
Okay, so at this point, we can advance to the next section of the presentation, and I'll invite Mr. Alm, our financial analysis supervisor, to walk us through the different scenarios.
Thank you, Mr. Wanalig, and thank you, Mr. Hodge. Great presentation. Good afternoon, members of the board. I don't know, we have members of the public here, staff. So this part of the presentation, I'll focus on what the board requested at the July meeting to come back to you and present some detail on debt financing. We just covered the interim financing. So here we're looking at potential debt financing, three scenarios that we'll present to you. You wanted to look at different scenario for a 5.5% rate increase versus a 4% rate increase. So we'll get into that in more details in terms of debt service payment and coverage ratios and so on. Next slide, please. But I want to start with this slide just to remind the board what's included in the baseline assumptions. So there's two sets of assumptions that are included as what we call the baseline. The first is the baseline include the preliminary actual activity for fiscal year end 24 that ended. And it also include the assumptions that's included in the adopted mid-cycle budget. So the mid-cycle budget was adopted in June. We adopted that budget in June. And the three key assumptions in that budget include a 5.5% rate increase effective March 1st of 2025. It includes $30 million in debt issuance in the current fiscal year that we'll talk about. And then it also include aggressive payment or contribution for pension and OPEB, retiree health benefits to get the two plans fully funded by June 2032. So those are the key assumptions included as part of the mid-cycle adopted budget. And then at the July workshop, the board discussed additional assumption, reviewed assumptions for rate setting, and that's include adding projects from the engineering report, totaling $29.1 million. 15 million of that is for PFAS treatment expansion. So that's 29.1 million. And also the board also reviewed other baseline adjustments such as the removing of the land sales, anticipated 2.5 million. You all reviewed that. We also updated costs for Delta Conveyance Project. Right now, we're updating the financial planning model to reflect the updated medical cost inflation based on what we receive from CalPERS, the premium. In addition, besides the 5.5% rate increase as part of the mid-cycle budget, the assumption also include another 5.5% rate increase March 1st, 2026, so the second year. And 5% after that, followed by a 4% annual increase. I mentioned $30 million in debt issuance as part of the mid-cycle budget. Throughout the rates workshop, added the assumption that we would issue additional $55 million in fiscal year 27. So that's a total of $85 million in new revenue bonds over the planning horizon. And as you heard earlier, planning horizon is looking at the current fiscal year plus the next 5 fiscal years, so a total of 6. But as we go through the scenario, that 85 baseline is already included in the number that I'll be discussing. So this is the baseline assumption metrics. So on the left is the general fund ending balances. On the right is the coverage ratio. So we start with the chart on the left, the metric. So the current ending balance for the general fund is $101.5 million. So that's at the beginning of the current fiscal year. The district started with a general fund ending balance, as you can see the third bar there, fiscal year end 25, $101.5 million. With the assumption that I just discussed, full funding for our capital programs, the general fund ending balances are projected to be at about $30 million at the end of the planning horizon, which is, as you can see, they're $47.5 million below the reserve target. Keep in mind, this also already includes the $85 million in debt issuance. So the fiscal year in 25, that $101.5 million, it includes the assumption that there's going to be $30 million in bond proceeds in the current year. So here are the 3 scenarios. The board asked us to come back and look at different scenarios. So we would like to discuss with you the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is a 4% rate increase in fiscal year end 25, and again in fiscal year end 26. That would mean debt issuing, a total debt issuing $160 million. Scenario 2, if we look at a 5% rate increase, the new debt amount would be $150 million. And the third scenario is looking at a 5.5% rate increase. That would mean a new debt amount of $140 million. Again, $85 million is already included as part of these amounts. So before we get into the detail of the debt payment and coverage ratio, I wanted to remind the board again on the capital projects. This shows the capital projects by funding source. As you can see there at the bottom, the total over the planning horizon, $525 million is programmed into our the adopted CIP, or capital improvement program, plus additional project I just mentioned. As you can see there, facility improvements at the top, that's for growth-related projects. Facility renewal fund, grants and reimbursement, bonds fund, and general fund pay-go. The biggest takeaway from this chart is that at the very last, second to the last row there, the general fund pay-go amount, a total $293 million of the total over the planning horizon. So that makes up 56% of the total capital program. It's the biggest piece of the funding source for the district. Bond fund, as I said, the baseline assumption at 85%, that only makes up about 16% of the total. So even if we issued 85 million, 56% funding would have to come from pay-go. Facility renewal fund and grants reimbursement, that's about 9% of the program, and facility improvement fund, that's about 19% of program. So when we look at the scenario to include whether it's $140 million in new debt or $160 million, pay-go funding would still be at approximately 50% of the total CIP program over the planning horizon.
So may I ask a question between the previous slide and this one
Yes.
to see if I can reconcile this? So we're talking about the difference between issuing 140, 150, 160 million at different rate increases. Do those amounts include this 85 million? Or
Yes.
is that-
Yes.
Okay, so it would be, we would take those numbers and deduct 85 million
The 140 includes the 85. So as you see the next slide, the 30, 55 plus an additional debt issuing at whether it's 55 million or 75 million, in addition to the 85.
Right, and is that over this same time horizon?
Yes,
Or extending beyond?
no, it's the same time horizon. So
Okay.
as you can see that the first issuing is fiscal year 25 amended budget, that's 30 million. Second issuing is fiscal year 27, that's 50 million. So the financial planning model assume a third issuing in fiscal year end 29 at whether it's 55 million or 70 million, depending on the.
Okay, that
the rate
fills in the
increase.
gap where the zeros are right
Correct.
now. Okay, got it.
Question. These charts assume 100% execution by the district of its project plan, of its plan development. We've never met 100%. I've seen it as low as 30% in past years. What is a reasonable execution rate that we should be putting in for the engineering functions of the district?
I guess I'd first respond to that by saying we actually went over 100% last fiscal year.
That is remarkable. Thank you, Gwen.
And we currently have several major projects in construction, and I have every belief that we'll hit 100% or very close to it again this fiscal year. And so, my recommendation would be to plan for success with execution of these capital projects. And then what will happen if we don't spend all of the money is we would just issue less bonds would be the most likely outcome.
Take out less commercial revolving or letters of credit. Well, thank you, and I'm impressed by that report. It'd be worthwhile to get that on an annual basis, our execution. I recall when the finance department rejected the business plans presented by engineering, because they argued we'd never met them. We've gone through several changes in that office, including Ed Stevenson. So it's remarkable. Thank you.
Well, you've heard me say in past years that while we were going pay as you go, we weren't getting everything done that we were planning on doing. And so we were building up these tremendous cash reserves. And I have always said the district should not be a bank for its customers. It needs to get the work done. So now that we finally are getting to the stage where we're burning off cash from our reserves, I'm feeling a lot better. It's good that we're getting work done. And all of it's coming at the same time, like in a 24-month period of time.
Thank you.
So just to add to the
Thank you,
major.
Mr. Huang.
Thank you.
Sorry to
for the
interrupt
question.
you with
So
some
no problem.
questions.
Anytime. Just to add to the major projects that are in the capital improvement program, just to give you an idea, there's 12 projects in the planning horizon that's over $10 million each. And some projects over 30 million. Significant. All right, so we'll get into the numbers here. This is scenario one, a 4% and a 4% rate increase. As I mentioned, the new debt amount 160 million. This would add 9.3 million in new debt service. So they're existing, we have a current debt service amount for the current fiscal year, that's 5.9 million. So with the three issuing, as I mentioned, 35 million, 55 million, and then 70 million, totaling 160 million. The total new debt service over the 30 years, just for the new debt issuing, is 287 million. So that's a big amount. And the good thing with the district is since the district has this strong debt capacity, as you can see the chart below, that the debt coverage is still going to be strong, over 300%, compared to the target of 200%. And this scenario, as you can see in the top chart, would bring the general ending fund balance to meet or close to meeting the reserve target policy.
I'm just going to make a quick comment here for interest of the board and staff. We had a comparison done on the debt coverage ratio for all of the participants in the Los Vaqueros Reservoir project. And almost everybody was down close to 125% of debt coverage capacity. It was only ACWD and Zone 7 that were much higher. And then I looked at some broader indices from AWWA, and for the California water districts, we are substantially ahead. So we still have a lot of debt capacity, even if we went up to 160 million and kept our rate increases to 4%. I shared that data with the staff here too.
Next slide, please. So we're looking at scenario 2, that's a 5% rate increase followed by a 5% rate increase. New debt amount comes down to 150 from 160. The new debt service total over 30 years, that's 269, close to 270 million. That's debt service over 30 years for the new issuance. Again, you see 3 issuances there. So new debt service, 8.7 million in annual debt service payment. These bonds would be issued over 30 years. Some of our current bonds are issued over 20 years. So this is looking at a 30-year bond. Again, debt coverage ratio for this scenario averages about 436%. Again, well above the 200% target. And the third and last scenario for your consideration is a rate increases of 5.5% and 5.5%. That would mean a new debt amount of 140 million, adding $8.1 million in new debt service to the current debt service, and then the total service debt service payment over 30 years is about 250 million. On our debt coverage, an average is, again, as you can see there, over 400% for this scenario as well. So that's conclude our 3 scenario that would ask us to come back and look at a couple of the scenario. We added another scenario for your consideration. That concluded this part of the presentation, and we would like, staff would like to receive your feedback and guidance in terms of the rate increase amount and a corresponding debt issuing amount as well.
Can I start off?
Yes, please.
Okay, so my observation here is that even with the minimum 4% rate increase, 160 million in debt issuance, we're ending the fiscal year 2030 at 400% debt coverage. Go to the next slide, we're at about 450, and you go to the next slide where we have 5.5% increase, and we're getting close to 500%. We are so far above other agencies at the end of our forecast period. So I would implore the board to stay conservative here, or as conservative as possible on the rate increase, because even with a 4% rate increase, we are substantially ahead of other water districts on our debt coverage ratio at the end of this forecast period, despite issuing 160 million in debt.
I would tend to support that argument. In great part, we're doing well. I have great frustrations with our rate structure, but we do have a drought surcharge we put in case the people stop using, instead of buying water, which is the bulk of our income, and it shouldn't be. So, and we're running a little tight, we can always cut back on our conservation programs. Because that's where the bulk of our income comes from, is commodity sales. 2/3 of it, if you can imagine, and only 20% of our cost is related to commodity. So we've got room to play. And as we stabilize our execution and engineering and get a more, and don't leave too much, get our budgets a little tighter, we'll get a far more responsible rate structure. So thank you.
May I add one point based on the last presentation that, and I hope I'm not wrong here, But when we're talking about the debt service, we're talking about at a fixed rate for, let's say, the $160 million. But if we're using interim financing vehicles, we should be lowering our cost of debt service during this period of time. And so that would yield an even higher debt coverage ratio over between now and 2030 or the early 2030s.
So the way I would envision this working is we're going to issue bonds in next spring. And then what would happen is next fall, we would begin, late in 2025, we would begin with the interim financing. And then as we have significant project expenditures, they would go against the interim financing. And then in 2027 and again in 2029, we would convert that from interim financing to long-term financing. So actually, we have financing costs related to the interim financing that do not yet appear in our financial model. And the costs that you see, we would expect to fully experience with issuing that amount of debt.
Okay. Do we have the potential for a WIFIA loan?
So WIFIA tends to be individual project specific. So you can't use WIFIA generally to fund a broad range of projects in a capital program. And for that reason, it's not as attractive for us. So if we had a single project that was like a $100 million project, it might make sense to pursue WIFIA. The other thing, though, is WIFIA as an interest rate is set at the Treasury 30-year bond rate plus 1 basis point. As a AAA rated agency issuing tax exempt debt, because Treasury bonds are not tax exempt, we can actually at times, again, depending on market conditions, we can be competitive with that rate. So WIFIA in itself is not necessarily going to provide us benefits even on an individual project basis, but doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of funding an entire program because the loans are for specific projects.
Let me ask another question. In the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic, the short-term yields on the yield curve have been higher than the 10-year and 30-year rates. And if we're now going to go into declining interest rate environment, we will probably see the yield curve at the short end lower, 10-year higher, 20-year higher, 30-year higher. So wouldn't we be benefiting on commercial paper from the lower end of the under 1 year rates?
So are you kind of suggesting that we never turn the interim financing into?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay, because once you turn it into the long-term bonds, then you've got your 30-year fixed, and so.
Yeah, but we can roll these things over on commercial paper, so we could postpone it until we have the right window.
Yeah, so you can keep postponing it, but then you're also going to have to take into account things like what's the amount that we're actually accumulating and rolling over. We do need to have a letter of credit that backs it, so the bank may only back up to a certain amount. You also have more interest rate volatility because the interest rate's going to get reset every 270 days. And if you miss your window, now you're going to have more costs because of the delay.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, those are all things we would take a look at and consider as we get into the process.
Yeah.
But as it relates to what's presented here within the financial model, this is based on when we expect for long-term bonds to be issued and the associated costs. And so if anything, we're missing some, modest costs related to interim financing. I don't think those costs would be material in terms of like a decision today for what level of rate increase percentage we need. But I
trust what you're saying is true, but remember from the prior presentation, and I know this personally in business, that the key benefit of commercial paper is flexibility. So usually you have you can see a year ahead of time what the interest rate market is going to be like based on actions of the Federal Reserve. So I would think now that we've made the turn, we're probably in a beneficial cycle.
Yeah, I would expect that. Again, we're 3 years away from kind of that first debt issuance where we'd be refunding commercial paper. So, we would just need to see what the conditions are like 3 years from now.
It's much like refinancing our previous bonds. We look for the window where we gain the most.
And hope that you don't wait too long and miss the best opportunity. Yes.
So I will echo comments made by Director Sethy. I think sticking with the 4% and 4% rate increase is a wise decision. This echoes what I shared at the last rate workshop as well. One of the things is that we have aimed to try to keep our rate increases steady, a little bit more consistent. And that 3 to 4% range is what we've generally shown the public. And so sticking to as close as possible to that, I think, is my preference. I think even with that, like Director Sethy mentioned, issuing $160 in new debt, we still meet our debt coverage ratio requirements. And I think we still are managing our finances in a very pragmatic fashion. So that's where I stand. I would be very supportive of the 4 and 4.
So I actually need one confirmation and have a question. So I am assuming since you're proposing 160 million new debt, that means we have the ability to execute and spend 160 million, right, in terms of projects?
Yeah, so
Okay.
maybe we can go back a few slides to the table. There we go. So we've got 525 million identified over, I think, a 7-year period here for capital projects. So we would expect, even with the full 160 million of debt, we'd still spend more in general fund pay-go than we'd be issuing bonds.
Okay, so even if some projects slip, we have enough room to be very confident that we'll spend the money. Okay, that is confirmation number one. And the second one is, are we anticipating any future project that will require a large bond issuance, such as a new treatment plant, maybe in Mission San Jose?
That sounds like a question for Mr. Stevenson or Mr. Awoke.
Well,
Right.
I would just offer this piece, not within this planning horizon.
Okay,
There are very large capital projects out in the future as we're talking about, Mission San Jose is an example.
Right.
Other water supply related infrastructure we have in our capital program, alternative water supply projects that could include purified water. It could include other things. Those are really, really expensive. And my sense is a lot of the share of those costs would be paid for through financing, through some form of bonding. But I'd say in this planning horizon, there's nothing like that. Our friends in project engineering shared a bit of a menu of some pretty expensive projects that have been folded into the assumptions here in the financial planning model that would be within the planning horizon, or at least would start within the planning horizon. So I'd say out in the future, very possibly, but in the nearer term, and unless Mr. Awoke has anything more to share or disagrees, I wouldn't see that as the need to do financing for a particular project.
okay. So I am fine with scenario number one. My only concern, which I think you address, is if we need to go out and borrow a large amount of money in the future, right? Our debt coverage ratio is down to what, 355%? I know it's above the 200%. I got that. But the slight concern in the back of my head is how much more capacity do we have, right? Because this is 30 years, right? Even though we're only looking at 6 years. Within this 30-year horizon, how much more money do we need to borrow? How much have we paid back, and how would our debt ratio change, right? That's a little bit playing in the back of my head. I totally got it within this planning horizon. We don't need it. Right, so I am okay with going with scenario number one, but I just want to make a note that there are concerns on my part that we should keep a fairly close control over the debt coverage ratio, just in case in the future we are hit with a project such as the PFAS project that we were not quite expecting that just show up. So I want to make sure we have enough capacity to go out to borrow money and still maintain a really good credit rating. Because that really is the bottom line. This point in time, I'm okay with scenario number one, but please keep an eye out. I know crystal balls are not always perfect and we get surprised, but it is our financial responsibility to make sure that we could pay for projects that we need.
And I think, with, scenario one, obviously, scenario three is kind of more aligned with the default planning assumptions. But I think all the scenarios are responsible decisions. I'll just say that scenario one, starts to spend our financial flexibility a little bit more. And it does mean that as we're faced with more cost pressures in the future, maybe a large project, we do start to have a little less flexibility. And, I think we end up in a scenario where, we're moving a little bit more in a direction of you may, in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, have presentations from us where we're, we have a little less flexibility and there's a little more pressure for larger rate increases in the future. Again, we're still maintaining over 300%. We're still good. We still have a lot of room. And so it's really about exactly how much of the flexibility do we want to spend now versus preserve for the future.
I assume before each one of these proposed bond issuance, we will be re-looking at this again and polish our crystal ball a little bit more to look at future liabilities, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll actually, we'll be doing another rates process before the second bond issuance in this series, right?
Okay,
So-
that's right. Good reminder. Thank you.
Unless there was any interest in adding a third or fourth year onto this, which I'm assuming there isn't.
We had a presentation at the Water Resources Committee meeting yesterday that the reliability of water quality in the Delta supply, Sethy Aqueduct, is of concern. 23% degradation in quality in 20 years. The tunnel, if it were to be built, would be longer than that in time. So if we start looking at seasonal water supplies coming out of the Delta and the impact on our local water delivery systems, the Sethy Aqueduct, we may be looking at a different host of projects here. And next time we come to it in a few years. So, thank you.
That's one of the reasons I could support item number one. Scenario number one, we could adjust. And yes, we would take our debt level higher, but this is only for 2 years. It's going to give us a little bit of feed. It helps our ratepayers a little bit as well. Maybe get some pipes in the ground, pay for some of that. So we can spend the money. And the money we're spending is long-term money. You put a pipe project in the ground, hopefully we're not going to tear up, Alvarado Niles for another 30 years. So we haven't really done this in the past. So we sort of, but we're facing we know we're facing challenges. But it looks like we could do this. And it's not like we're setting something tonight that would be for 30 years. We're setting something for tonight that's 4 years, 2 years, excuse me. And it looks like it's a safe bet. We can adjust if we need to. So 2 years is not gonna, hopefully 2 years, it's not gonna be critical. It's like we've got it covered. I could support item number 1, scenario 1.
Yeah, I think we have pretty consistent feedback, so we know what to prepare for December in terms of the amount of the rate increase percentage. And so now we can advance to, I think, the next section, which I'll be presenting, which is some more follow-up on the concept of going into different customer classes with uniform rates in each class.
Sorry,
And
before we move on, can I just request?
Yeah, breaker. Um,
5:21 now, we can go to 5:30, 5:35.
5:35. 5:35. We're doing all right.
Okay.
Okay, we're back in session. Before we move on, the general manager would like to some comments.
Yeah, thank you, President Gunther. Just want to make note that during our break, I had an opportunity to review my email, and within the probably 50 emails I received this afternoon was one from a customer, Ken Nishimura, on issues that are being discussed this evening. So I've printed out copies for the board and for staff, and we're also going to make sure that it's on the website. But I wanted to just summarize the first couple of topics, and then as we go this evening and talk about the other items on the agenda, the other topics to be covered at the workshop, then Mr. Wunderlich will also provide a little of the context that we received in this letter, this comment letter. It's from Ken Nishimura, whose service address is on record with the district. First of all, an initial sort of comment about the timing that we conduct these workshops and their accessibility to members of the public. The comment is that based upon the timing and the days of the week that we hold these workshops, that they can be very inconvenient to those folks that are working. And it's difficult to expect a full and robust participation from the public in workshops like this. In terms of the interim financing topic, Mr. Nishimura points out that the use of a revolving line of credit might have a tendency to erode the district's sort of financial discipline, which we've been very good at in the past, suggesting that it's pretty easy to renew and to exercise that instrument. And then it's sort of drawing a comparison to a giant credit card for the district, whereas a short-term note requires more discipline, more significant action to reissue, and then a little bit higher level of scrutiny because of the additional steps needed to use that instrument. And then suggesting that a commercial paper is similar in that way. But it's has limited maturity, which could hinder some flexibility. So that was his comment related to the interim financing. But as a reminder there, the board's not really making a decision about that. It's just more introducing the topics in the context of a different and greater use of debt moving forward. In terms of the rate increase amount that the board just discussed, Mr. Nishimura is suggesting that the 4% proposal provides less flexibility to address future costs, including potential regulatory costs, whereas the 5% proposal seems to strike a good balance in his opinion between the indebtedness and the flexibility and the impact to the customers. And these are very much the same topics that the board discussed when deliberating that item. So again, Mr. Wunderlich will cover sort of a summary of this type of input for the items that we'll discuss next. But I wanted to make sure that that was brought up here in the meeting, and then also extend my apologies to Mr. Nishimura for not having caught that letter before the board meeting, and the board and public too, because it would have been great to share that context before the board deliberated on those items. So with that, I think we can continue on with our next topic in the workshop.
Okay,
All right. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so in August, we first presented on this concept in response to board feedback. And what this does is it breaks all customers into 3 distinct classes: single family residential, dedicated landscape irrigation, and then all other customers as a third group, which hereafter is referred to as urban in the presentation, and that is commercial, industrial, institutional, multifamily residential. And then developing a unique uniform rate for each customer class based on the cost of service for those customers based on their demand patterns. And last month, the board asked for more about this, in particular for more data about dedicated landscape accounts. And so that's what we're here to present this evening. Next slide. And so, again, this section and the rest of the presentation are all modeled after an assumption of a 5.5% rate increase based on what the default was. So just, bear with us as we continue to reference those numbers for the rest of the evening. But from a comparison perspective, I think all the information is still highly relevant. And so with that approach, we would have $5.24 per unit if we just had a single customer class, and then shown here are the differences if we were to break it into the 3 different classes, with single family, essentially no change, dedicated landscape going up, and urban going down, about 10 cents a unit. And just to give some context to how many customers and how much consumption there is within these groups, by far most district customers are single family residential. It makes up 44% of consumption. Urban, is down to a little under 10,000 accounts and is a similar amount of consumption as single family residential. And then landscape is about 2,600 accounts at a little over 10% of consumption. And so let's go to the next slide. And so now to kind of, where kind of the questions were is, hey, can we get into more detail about these landscape accounts and what they look like? And so 744 of them are residential, meaning that's irrigation at a multifamily complex or for an HOA. And then industrial, which would just be outdoor irrigation for an industrial site. So really the determination, so all these dedicated landscape accounts, for the most part, they're at a property or at a location that also has an indoor water service account, right, for their indoor needs. And the classification of the dedicated landscape account is just going to mirror what the related urban or residential account is. So like if it's a manufacturing site, then the dedicated landscape irrigation for the outside of that site would be coded as industrial irrigation. Same for business, like a restaurant or a hotel or something like that. And then the cities and schools and parks fall under the institutional or other group. And so if we look down here and look, okay, how much irrigation is occurring within those different subgroups of dedicated landscape irrigation customers, we see that the largest at about a third of the dedicated landscape irrigation is at the residential sites. And the least is at the industrial, and the business and institutional there is in the middle. And so, for example, focusing on parks and schools, that subgroup is about a quarter of the dedicated landscape, and that equates to about 3% of total district consumption. Next slide. And so, again, based on the comments from last month, we wanted to look a little more deeply within that institutional landscape space. And we can see that the city of Fremont is the largest user, which shouldn't be a surprise because of the parks operated by the city, followed by East Bay Regional Parks in the 2 cities, and then schools. And so that's where most of that consumption is occurring. If we look at even our biggest user, city of Fremont, for their dedicated landscape irrigation, when you get down to it on the far right column, they represent 1% of total district-wide water demand. Next slide. And so, as staff, as we consider to continue to think about this and, what are some of the issues surrounding this concept, one of the things we wanted to point out is that, pretty much all of the dedicated landscape accounts are attached to an urban account, whether that's a multifamily residential complex or a manufacturing facility. Obviously with, or a school, with some parks, maybe that's not quite the case, but, for most of these accounts and most of the consumption, they are connected. And what would happen is those customers, they receive all those bills together. And then they're probably not going to see a change in terms of what the overall total bill amount is that they receive bi-monthly across all their accounts. We found that the overall change is pretty modest. 2 cents for single family, 10 cents for urban. And those accounts are representing 97% of district customers with almost 90% of the consumption. Overall, we weren't totally sure. We had, I think, a difficult time really trying to figure out what could the potential conservation potential be. Certainly, it would support some additional conservation for the dedicated landscape accounts, but for your other customers, it's a slight decrease in the cost. So, we're not really, we don't feel like we're in a position to offer an estimate of what it would mean for overall district-wide water demands. And then, one of the other things that came up in some of our internal discussions is that the accounts that would face the bigger impact here, you're talking about parks and school playing fields, which we feel like provide broader community benefits, and especially as we see more and more residential customers going away from having lawns at their home, they probably rely more on those community spaces. And so, if we had maybe seen bigger differentials or some different situation in terms of how much consumption fell into the different buckets, I think we might have been more inclined to say that we should really keep looking into this. But, as we looked at it and considered those things, this is not something that staff, kind of sees enough of an impact where we would suggest that we keep pursuing it. So that concludes staff's presentation on this topic. But just to quickly summarize Mr. Nishimura's comments on this, he essentially felt that this does not meet his desired goal of shifting the incremental cost of more water onto the customers with the highest usage, but more kind of sends it to the classes that have more variable usage over the course of the year. And, he kind of felt that based on his view of the complexity of breaking this out and communicating it, and that most customers would see little to no benefit, his suggestion is that, he's, as a public commenter, is not suggesting that the district would pursue this. So with that, we'll stop. Happy to take any board questions or feedback on this item.
I just have a quick comment. So I'm very thankful that the staff went through the analysis. I was the one who asked, or primarily asked for the information. Between the last presentation and this one, I concluded it was not proper to go ahead with this kind of billing mechanism. And I took some other thoughts into consideration based on what the State Water Board is doing in terms of trying to move us toward budget-based billing and all that kind of stuff. I don't know when that's going to come to fruition, but I really like the statistics that came out of this. I think that it gives us a better, broader knowledge of who our customer base is, how water's being used. And I agree with the, after seeing the accounts and everything, that we have a broader mission as a district, which is to to serve our three communities and our schools and everything too, so. I'm glad you did the analysis so I could think it through. But I agree with the staff.
I am supportive of the prior comment, just these comments from Director Sethy. The total dollar amounts and differentials are not much. Going down the trail of tears has its own obligations and difficulties and confusion. Trying to charge more for a dedicated landscape service, which is really where most of your conservation would come from. And you want to encourage people to put in dedicated landscape services, not discourage them with a higher rate, particularly when it's not going to have any real impact on the total water consumption in the end, would be unfortunate. I note that we have an $8 an acre foot number that was used by some of these institutions that were listed on the chart for almost 500,000 acre feet. And I can foresee additional conversions from the schools and municipalities to create municipal recreation on the school sites and get $8 an acre foot versus the several thousand, $4,000 an acre foot that we currently charge for tap water. So we're putting this on hold. Rate-based conservation, it does not work. We've been part of studies that show it doesn't work. And so therefore the fundamental principles behind this are not sound. So thank you. But thank you for the data.
Well, I concur with staff's findings as well, and with some of the comments made by my fellow directors. I don't think that this really achieves anything significant for us or for our customers. And I think it's fine to move away from this. I'll just echo that I thought the statistics on slides 37 and 38 in particular were very, very interesting and very fascinating.
I'll just make it short. I agree with staff recommendation. It's not worth pursuing these changes.
Same here. Data's interesting. Appreciate it. Appreciate your efforts.
Okay, so I think with that, we're prepared to move to the last section of today's presentation, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Gabe Sasser from HF&H to lead us through it.
Good evening, board, staff, and public. I'm Gabe Sasser with HF&H, and tonight I'm here to present on the issue of the uniform or tiered consumption charges to be assessed to your single-family residential customers. As you know, your current practice as the district is to charge one uniform rate to all customers, meaning there's one customer class. And the rationale for that is that it's very easy to maintain from a billing perspective, easy to calculate from both a billing perspective as well as for your customers. It's a single volumetric charge multiplied by the volume used by the customer. Again, the options for you to consider are to maintain this current policy or to introduce the idea of two separate customer classes, a single family residential customer class based on a 2 or a 3 tiered rate structure, and secondarily, an all others customer class that would continue to be charged based on the uniform rate. Tiered rates are best suited for customers exhibiting homogeneous demand patterns, and this is true for single-family customers who use water for two purposes: health and sanitary reasons for indoor water use, and secondarily for outdoor irrigation purposes. The size of the tiers are based on actual demand patterns and not on water budgets. Secondarily, the other class for all others, as Mr. Wunderlich previously alluded to in his presentation, would include all commercial, industrial, and multifamily residential customers. And because of the diverse range of water usage for these customers, we would recommend a uniform consumption charge and have assumed so in this analysis. Should you choose to pursue a tiered rate structure, the outcomes that would result from this would be tiered rates would allocate the higher costs of the additional sources of supply required to service the customers who demand more water. And uniform rates would still be applied to all customers in the commercial, industrial, and multifamily residential space. Tiered rates are used by many California jurisdictions to recognize the higher costs of water to those higher water users. Those higher costs are typically captured as higher water supply costs, conservation programs, and in some agencies, not in this one, capital infrastructure supporting that additional demand. Tiered rates are not arbitrary. They must be based on the calculation of the actual cost of providing water service at each tier of a given usage level. And those tiers, again, are specific to the demand patterns of the agency and the customers they support. The tiered rates tonight presented for discussion are based solely on the higher cost sources of supply that the district must incur to satisfy this additional demand. Again, to reiterate, your current approach is a uniform rate structure. The district currently charges $4.97. Again, for this presentation, we've assumed a financial planning model default of a 5.5% increase. So the projected rates will be based on that. And so we're reflecting that $5.24. But for your point of reference, it's a 7-cent change. It's $5.17 for a 4% increase. And again, the potential approach is to create the two customer classes as you see on the slide. For the single family rate analysis, we analyzed two different scenarios. In scenario one, we developed a two-tiered rate structure with a breakpoint based on winter water use demand. Winter water use demand serves as a firm estimate for indoor water use. And this would be based on 1,300 cubic feet based on single family residential water use demand patterns. Scenario two uses a three-tier rate structure with two breakpoints. The first breakpoint being the winter water use demand, and the second breakpoint being the peak day demand to categorize the typical summertime use when outdoor irrigation is at a high. And then for all water use exceeding the peak day demand threshold, that water use at the tier 3 level for water use exceeding 2,400 cubic feet would be billed at that tier 3 level. I will note that these tiers and just to backtrack, the demand patterns are based on the calendar year 22 and 23 actual water use. These are the rates for your contemplation based on the 5.5% increase. Again, the $5.24 for a uniform charge. For scenario one, the two-tiered rate structure, the tier 1 customers, those using 1,300 cubic feet or less, would pay less than the uniform charge. And the tier 2 customers, their rates would include all the costs associated with tier 1, as well as water conservation program costs, conservation rebates, and the water audits, as well as the appropriate staffing costs, as well as the water supply costs from the more expensive sources of supply, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission and your groundwater source, as well as the semi-tropic water banking. In scenario 2, again, the tier 1 rate is the same as the tier 1 rate under scenario 1. And the only distinction is that both the tier 2 and the tier 3 rates account for the water supply costs. And the difference between tier 2 and tier 3 is that only tier 3 use would recover the cost of the water conservation programs. So there's really three factors we present to you tonight. The first being the bill impacts for your consideration of which rate structure you would like to pursue for single-family residential customers. These bill impacts revisit what we've previously analyzed and presented, but I'll go through them and please stop me if you have any questions. There's 4 levels of demand, which range from 8 to 4,800 cubic feet on a bi-monthly basis. And on a per day basis, this ranges from 100 to 598 gallons per day. We compare the bills at your current rates to the bills at the proposed uniform rates, assuming a 5.5% increase. And this is demonstrated by the percentage difference on the bottom of the chart. All customers would see a uniform percentage increase if you maintain your existing structure. Now, when we compare bills at current rates to bills at the proposed 2-tiered rate structure, there are differences. For low and average customers, those using 8 or 1,600 cubic feet, you would see very small adjustments to their bill, to your bill as a single-family customer. And conversely, for the higher water users, in both the high and the very high column, we're demonstrating significantly larger increases. And this is supporting the notion that tiered rates bill customers who use more, or customers who use more, thus pay for more. And so for additional context, we provide the percentage of bills up to flow assumption. So that row is recording the percentage of annual bills of all single-family customers according to usage. So that means that 27% of all bills in a given year were bi-monthly consumption total of 800 cubic feet or less. And that as we look further to the right, 65% of all annual single-family residential bills had a consumption level of 1,600 cubic feet or less. And this also means that 38% of bills had usage between 9 and 1,600 cubic feet. So said a different way, 65% of all bills would see at most an increase of $2.58 under this structure. And again, for customers using greater than the average, they would see significantly larger increases. On the 3-tiered rate structure bill impacts comparison, we see a similar theme, albeit a little bit more pronounced. For the low and average columns, those customers would see very small adjustments to their bills. And again, the high and the very high water users would see larger impacts and increases to their bills, and even in comparison to the 2-tiered rates. Sorry about that. A second consideration to evaluate single-family residential rate structure is to consider revenue stability, or inversely, the volatility of the revenues that are received from the single-family commodity charge. So to do this, we ask the question, what proportion of overall water rates revenue originates from the commodity charge revenues specific to single-family customers? And we looked at 5 scenarios, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. And under those 5 scenarios, how does the percentage of the commodity charge revenues from this specific class of customers change based on the rate structure as well as the consumption? So those 5 scenarios, number 1, we have the baseline, and that's according to calendar year 2023 water use. There are 2 additional scenarios for assuming a decrease in water usage, a 10% decrease from the baseline and a 20% decrease from the baseline. And then in a better case scenario, a 10% increase and a 20% increase from the baseline. Some additional assumptions in our analysis include, again, that baseline revenues assume the 5.5% increase in the rates that I've touched upon on previous slides. The comparison, again, relies solely on calendar year 2023 water use patterns, and that a change in water demand applies to all customers, not just single-family customers. We found that the volatility of revenues increases with the number of tiered rates. Said a different way, uniform rates yield the smallest change in revenues relative to consumption. If water usage drops, uniform rates yield the lowest decrease in revenue. And in the case of 3 tiers, this rate structure results in the highest decrease in revenue. And conversely, when water usage increases, uniform rates result in the smallest increase in revenue, and a 3-tiered rate structure results in the largest increase in revenue. While there are differences in stability, the variance is small. Under the worst case scenario of a 20% reduction in consumption, when we compare the revenue reductions under both the uniform and the 3-tiered rate structure, the difference is only about 1.1 million, or 1% of your overall rate revenues. And that's what this first table on this slide shows. So the first table has the 5 consumption scenarios. And in the worst case, we have the -20, or the 20% reduction. And in that case, under a uniform rate structure, revenues would reduce by 16.3 million. And those are revenues specific to only the single family residential commodity charge. Under the 2-tiered rate structure, revenues would reduce by 17.3. And finally, under the 3-tiered structure, revenues would reduce by 17.4. So the difference, the 1.1, is really just the result of comparing the 17.4 million to the 16.3 million. The second table seeks to look at how much of the overall rate revenue that the district collects is recovered through the single-family residential commodity charge. And this proportion fluctuates based on consumption. So we looked at a range. How does that overall share of the district's pie of revenue, so to speak, change as consumption changes? With a 20% reduction from typical consumption, the percentage of revenue is 25.1% for a uniform single-family residential rate structure. And conversely, on the best case scenario, under a 20% increase in demand, this results in single-family commodity charges making up 29.2%. And so what we looked at is the spread between these extremes. And for the uniform rate structure, that's a spread of 4.1%. For the 2-tiered rate structure, it's a spread of 5.3%. And for the 3-tiered rate structure, a spread of 5.6%. Again, demonstrating that the 3-tiered rate structure has the greatest volatility, albeit the difference between the 3 is small. And the final consideration is a break-even analysis. And this is really to look at, under the 3 various rate structures, when are commodity charges the lowest under a given rate structure in relation to your current practice of the uniform rate structure. So on this graph, on the y-axis, we have the commodity charges, or the consumption charges. On the x-axis, we have the specific consumption levels on a bi-monthly basis. The black line demonstrates the consumption charge under a uniform rate structure, the orange line under a 2-tiered rate structure, and the blue line under a 3-tiered rate structure. So this chart serves to answer 3 questions. 1, when are customers paying less in commodity charges under a 2-tiered rate structure in contrast to uniform rates? And the answer is when customers use less than 2,000 cubic feet, as denoted by the first bubble. The second question, when are customers paying less under a 3-tiered rate structure in contrast to uniform rates? And that's when customers use less than 2,500 cubic feet, as denoted by the second bubble. And the third bubble seeks to answer the question of who, under which rate structure do customers pay less for a given level of consumption? And the answer is that under a three-tiered rate structure, customers pay less up to the breakpoint of 3,100 cubic feet. So these are the rates for your consideration. Again, we have the uniform rate structure, assuming the 5.5% increase, and we will adjust these to the 4% based on your guidance from earlier this evening. And then we have the two-tiered rate structure and the three-tiered rate structure, both of which the tiered 1 rate would be less than the uniform rate. And the tier 2 and the tier 2 and tier 3 rates under the various scenarios would seek to recover the higher costs of source of supply that the district must incur for those additional demands. With that, I'll open up to questions, comments.
And perhaps I could read the feedback from our member of the public at this point. I think we're all familiar with Mr. Nishimura's preferences on this topic. And so his feedback is requesting implementation of a tiered rates structure with a two-tier structure as soon as practicable, and that perhaps moving to 3 tiers could be considered in the future if that was determined valuable.
And I'll also just make a quick note for the board and the folks here in the boardroom that we had another member of the public who's joined us online. And I know who this person is because this person has reached out to me recently, and I appreciate that. But I will let that person share this person's identity if that person so chooses. And certainly, if you have any comments to make or questions to ask, please go ahead and raise your hand, and the instructions are on the top of the agenda.
What if I lead off? So Director Weed was not at the last meeting where we were talking about this subject. But at that meeting, it was the first time in my experience on this board that we were suddenly talking about equity pricing. I'd never heard that in a board meeting before. It was always, if we went to tiered rates, it was conservation pricing. And that is what is talked about when we go to Aqua. I've never even heard equity pricing in any Aqua session. It's always been related to conservation pricing. That's point number one. Point number two is we recognize that our revenues have flattened out right now. And if we're going to try to preserve our revenue, gentlemen, speaking, if we're going to try to preserve our revenue, the result of tiered rates is a decline in revenue, especially if you go to 3 tiers. So we're losing money, and we may not even be calculating the full experience of that, because at the higher end, it really will be a severe conservation consequence. Boy, that's hard to say. So I think we need to look at this from a revenue perspective, and tiered rates does not result in maintaining the revenues that we need for the district. 3, if you take a look at slide, well, here it's 49, 40, hold on. 47 and 48. If you see the chart that the gentleman just showed lastly here, where the break-even points are, the people who benefit are at 20 HCF or lower compared to the uniform rates. That's well above where the low and the average is. And if we're trying to provide optimal benefit for people that are at the very low end at eight units or somewhere thereabouts. Most of those customers classify under our Help on Tap program, and we dismiss the service charge, which is 2/3 of their charge already. So, and if you go above that to 16 units, and I was just saying my bill for the last period was 13 units, well, the benefit is negligible. And it is very punitive at the high and the very high level. So if you're trying to achieve conservation, I think there's some good theory to that, but it's not applicable in our district. I see districts where it is applicable because of limited water resources. And if we're trying to provide equity pricing, there is no benefit here. It is so negligible as to be undetectable. And so I do not support any of this. I'm not going to use any bad language here, but this infuriates me when we are looking at something that has absolutely no rationale in our district.
Let me see if I can compound on that. It's unfortunate that you were given our dysfunctional rate structure to work with. We don't match fixed costs with fixed income and variable costs with variable income. Proposition 218 was a state proposition that said we should match the cost of service to what we give customers. That was one of the reasons that the Natural Resources Council best management practices were gotten rid of in 2008. That called for a 70% minimum on the consumption side, commodity side. Our first step should be to double our service charge and cut our our commodity cost in half. That would be a step in the right direction. We have more to go. We're also working on some false premises in the way we operate our district. So I understand you were looking at the cost of San Francisco water as to be the incremental cost difference in for the tiered rates. We have a minimum purchase requirement from San Francisco. So we have to buy that water anyway. And we don't separate it. It's put into the mix and it's delivered a little bit to everybody. So there's no defined service area for that more expensive water. It fails on that principle and might get thrown out in a court challenge. Equity, I prepared this memo, which I handed to you earlier, which I have argued that if you want real equity, you bring the commodity cost down to no more than 20% of the total bill. And it should be probably less, water, power, and chemical cost, maybe 15%, and look at a zero tier across the board. That way, people who use the desired level of water would not get a bill for the commodity. And then take the service charge and put it on the property tax where the property owner pays for it. Separating those two elements. That would be an equitable situation. No water bill would be, I think, is the epitome of equity. So we've thought of that in the past. I've proposed it, and I encourage us, but I would thank you for your efforts, but I think they're unfortunately based on a poor premise, and in the case of the San Francisco incremental water cost, a false premise. Thank you.
I had one other thought, if you might allow me, that concerns me. And that is that ACWD for more than 30 years has been part of CUA, among the largest urban water districts in California. And we have cases that are at the appellate court right now where decisions have yet to be made on all aspects of Proposition 218. And the one thing I do not want to do is put a target on our backs by changing our rate structure. Because then we're just opening ourselves up, inviting in Howard Jarvis and the GAN organization, other groups that can sue the district. And the cost of fighting those lawsuits is a lot more than what is in any possibility gained by going to tiered rates. And I'm very concerned that we not put a target on our back, that we not be exposed. We don't expose our customers. So I fully support the status quo, keep uniform rates, keep it simple.
And unfortunately, we have a drought surcharge, which is in effect a tiered rate. I think with the proper structure of our rates, that could go away. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the presentation. So I'm of course in favor of tiered rates. I've spoken on this for the last 8 years I've been on the board. One of the things that I will say about the current situation actually echoes Director Sethy's latest comment about some uncertainties with Prop 218 and specifically putting a target on the district's back if we were to move in this direction before some of those cases are litigated. Of course, that's kind of weighing heavy in my decision. I personally, if the board is in favor of moving in the direction of tiered rates today, I would certainly vote in favor of it. But I think that is the one concern that I have that would potentially change my mind about moving to tiered rates in this round versus in a couple of years after some of these cases have been decided on. That's where I currently stand. Of course, my rationale for tiered rates has been shared in the last couple of rate workshops as well. So relitigate all of that, but that's my thinking at current situation.
So I definitely support tier rate. It's no secret. I think I've been very consistent in this position. And I also believe going through tier rate, there is a fairness issue, equity issue. We are lucky in the sense that we have different water supply sources with fairly different prices. It does make logical sense that everybody should benefit from the cheaper water supply equally. So in that sense, I definitely support tier rates. In terms of water sales, I think even tier rates will supply us with staff's help enough financial stability, right? At least in my opinion and based on what has been presented. I am sensitive to the legal uncertainty, but I also feel strongly that this is where we should eventually end up. What I am willing to do is postpone this decision for another rate cycle, which is 2 years for us. But I would ask staff to actually monitor the situation legally in terms of our exposure and get back to us. We do have a mid-cycle evaluation possibility. So just let us know as a board when is there enough certainty legally for us to head down this path, and then we could have another chat.
Yeah, there's, I think what we'll be preparing for is a 2-year cycle, but there's certainly no restriction on convening before the 2 years are up. And I will say that there have been several bills related to affirming legal authority for tiered rates that have been signed by the governor just within the past week, and really, I'll say, undermine some of the court decisions that have maybe cast some shadows on some of the standard methodologies that are used.
I'm just gonna say that I am naturally risk averse, and it shows in some of my decisions. I understand they are changes, but I want to have the court go through its process. I don't really want to volunteer to be the first person to be an example for any lawsuit. So I do understand and sympathize with, agree with the rest of the director that we don't really want to be the one with the big giant target as a test case. But one very last point, I think comments were made about revenue stability. We need to sell more water. But just a reminder to the rest of the director, at the last board meeting, we were informed that we have a new target to meet that we potentially cannot meet in 2035 in terms of the state requirement for water conservation. So this potentially, I will say right now, this is not ready just because of the legal implication. But this potentially could be a tool for us at some point in time when it's appropriate.
I guess I'm last here, but a lot has been said. I think the next couple of years, Director Sethy and I could discuss his comments, because I support the idea, but however, I'm willing to listen. As of right now, there's storm clouds out there. The lawsuit, I agree 100%. It's a target on our backs. The concept of putting charges on the tax bill, target on our backs. We don't want that. We don't need it. We don't have to do it. We could keep looking at it. Gives us a couple years to study this and see. I'm perfectly fine. I think our rate, the drought surcharge worked exceptionally well. So I don't believe tier rates are going to be necessary at the moment to achieve what we have to do. So for now, I like the data. Sure, Director Sethy and I will have some comments and discussions over the next couple of years. Maybe you can convince me to come off the wall. But there's one wall tonight I'm not coming off, and that's the storm clouds and the legal situation. I think is just too dangerous to go this route. Well, we don't have to. We'll just hold steady on our course. We have great data. We have fantastic data that says we don't have to move the service charge from where we are today. We know how much water we're going to sell, pretty much, during a drought. We have that data.
And why do we need a drought surcharge?
Well, another discussion at another time, not particularly on the agenda this evening. So with that, I think we've hopefully given staff enough direction.
I believe that's enough direction. We know exactly what to prepare now for December, so I think we can advance to the next slide. So we will plan for maintaining the current rate structure exactly as it exists today, with a notice that's for 2 years with a 4% increase per year effective March 1, 2025, and again, March 1, 2026, with the understanding of the feedback that if certain legal questions are settled and there's a board interest, we may come back before the end of those 2 years. And you'll probably see us back in about a year to start talking about specifics with a interim financing program. And so that will be Mr. Alm and Mr. Coran have been given a full employment act this evening for the next 5 or 6 years. But in terms of next steps, HF&H will prepare a report to support the proposed increases as have been discussed. That report will be presented to the board at the December 12th board meeting, along with a proposed notice, Proposition 218 notice, and a proposal to set a hearing date for a public hearing to consider the rate increase. And potentially that would happen February 13th at the regular February board meeting. And so that concludes staff's presentation for this evening.
I think just make one final comment. I just wanted to thank staff again for all of the the work that went into this. I've been through now 3 or 4 rate cycles since joining the board, and I just have to say, I feel like this one's been one of the most comprehensive. All of ours have been comprehensive, but in this case, I think we've been able to consider a lot of different options that haven't been brought to in front of the board, at least since I joined. So just wanted to say thank you again for all of the information.
And I have one brief comment to request that we receive data on the number of referrals we do to collection agencies, both in number and dollar amount, to show there's a trend and hopefully develop policies that will bring that to zero and eliminate the practice. Thank you.
Well, Director Akbari, you beat me to it because I was going to thank staff and our consultants for all the hard work that culminated in tonight's meeting, but also for the many months that we've been holding these workshops and going through all of these issues in great detail, and thank the board because this is some of the toughest stuff that that we discuss, and these are some of the chewiest issues that you all work on, and I really do appreciate the thought and the effort that you all put into these issues. So appreciate that. Glad to be at this point. Just a reminder too, if there's any comments, questions for our member of the public who's observing, you're welcome to chime in at any point. Just raise your hand in the Zoom application and we'll make sure to get you.
Seeing none, I believe we are on to general manager's reports.
That is
which
correct.
Is a big one.
Well, I'm going to try and keep it short. I mean, it's a big deal, but there's not a whole lot of detail to report at this point. But I just thought that it's an important development in the world of water in the West, and has a lot to do about something the district has been very, very engaged in for some years now. And that is the Los Vaqueros Reservoir Expansion Project. And I think we all know at this point that last week, the Contra Costa Water District Board of Directors at their regular board meeting last week gave direction to their staff to exit the Joint Powers Authority. In that discussion at that board meeting, the board cited a significant increase in project costs, a decrease in the expected yield of water in the project due to new and more restrictive permit conditions, unresolved risks that would be potentially Contra Costa would be exposed to related to having the dam out of service during construction. And, you know, staff, certainly we at the district, we understand and we acknowledge Contra Costa's position and their difficult decision. We also understand because we are engaged in a lot of these types of projects and big efforts and initiatives in the West, that trying to do anything of scale in water in the West is a really, really difficult thing to do. And oftentimes they aren't successful in their first iteration. So we do, though, appreciate the very significant efforts that Contra Costa and all of the other partner agencies have put into this project over several years to work through all of those issues. And of course, we remain supportive of this type of a regional effort, and we look forward to continuing to work with the partners to see if there are other opportunities or other efforts that can benefit the region and ACWD's customers. And we remain optimistic and interested in these types of regional projects. We understand California's water infrastructure needs work, needs dedicated efforts to try and improve things. And we understand that, you know, partnerships and regional efforts are a big part of how those things can be successful. So our state needs these types of efforts, and certainly ACWD's customers benefit from them. So beyond that, I mean, staff are engaging with the local agency partners on next steps. There'll be a discussion next week, and then of course the JPA board, full board has yet to reconvene and discuss. So there'll be certainly more information to come out of these developments, but I thought it was a little bit too large of an elephant to not address in at least a quick general manager's report this evening.
Comment?
We do have one other general manager's report. It's not on the agenda, but we thought it's a big deal too. And we thought the board would be interested in this topic. So I think it's a tag team GM report. And we'll start off with this big news, which is pretty good news, with Mr. Awoke sharing what this is all about.
Well, thank you for the suspense, Mr. Stevenson. I appreciate the introduction of the item. So I wanted to report to the board that the PFAS ion exchange treatment project has finally been substantially completed, and we are starting to put water into the system this week. As you know, this project took about 2 years from inception, initial design to construction being completed. So it took a lot of innovative approaches. We've been before this board providing updates and seeking guidance. And I'm just happy to report that the team worked tirelessly to get us to this point. And I want to thank not only the project engineering team, but also, internal district staff and various divisions that put a lot of effort into this project. And I do want to turn it over to my colleague on the other side of the table to tell us about some operational updates regarding the system. But I did want to share that news. Jake?
Thank you, Mr. Awoke. Yes, can't state, words can't put it how important this is, both to meet our demand, continuously meet our demand, and put PFAS compliant into our system. As you all recall, it was just a couple of years ago, it seemed like endless warnings and then actual regulations stating we had to reduce the amount of PFAS in the water, essentially, which in turn means reducing our production and arguably the most important facility we have due to its location and its production capacity. It was a big deal. And production began scoping out the project, turned it over to project engineering, and began construction. And construction itself was huge. Our staff refers to PT Wellfield as PT Minefield. The reason is we've had a lot of construction there over the years. And as any project engineer will tell you, it's quite a bit of work just to manage the contractors alone, better yet, all these different obstacles that come up. I think every time I was out at the well field, I ran into either Uriel or Kerry dealing with one problem after another they had to troubleshoot. So yesterday I was out there, I read an HMI screen and I was able to see live that the gallons per minute of PFAS compliant water going to the blender, it was just enormous. So we're not done, we're almost there. I don't want, knock on wood. 1 train is online, 2 more are anticipated to be online Monday. So, yeah, just want to thank everybody. Like I said, this kind of reminds me of AMI and other projects. It was really all hands on deck. It took a lot of collaboration. And I will say also to Groom and his staff, the speed of this was quite impressive. I've seen a lot of big projects in my time here at the district. And frankly, I didn't anticipate this project to get done in such a quick time. And also to my own staff, to make it operationally this quick, I didn't anticipate we'd be here talking about this today. I think we just had a committee meeting out there a couple months ago, and I think I gave an estimate. I was playing it kind of safe, but like January, and I get back to you guys and say, we're pushing PFAS compliant water in the system, and here we are today saying that.
Well, Jim and I were out there 2 months ago for the Water Quality Committee. And having been there quite a few times before, I couldn't believe how complex the system is and the piping. And of course, we have all of this embedded piping that's already in the ground at different elevations, way deep down into the ground. And so it really is a minefield. It's like you got an oil field or a chemical factory out there. And you've got 6 layers of piping going in all different directions. And it was very impressive to see everything before it was covered up, all the trenches and everything. I don't know if Jim wants to add to that, but it was.
Yeah, it's an impressive facility.
I hope
the levels and
You're going to have to balance this out, how you want to articulate this to the press, but I think for the water industry as a whole in California, this is quite an accomplishment for our district.
Yeah, been talking internally, and we were talking about how It went online just a couple of days ago, and today our customers are far, far better off than they were just a couple of days ago. And that's a huge milestone, and it's something that doesn't happen very often, right? Frankly, on the time scale of water, when you're talking about water treatment and facilities, basically once a generation you add a facility or make big facility changes. This is a big moment for the district. I did want to throw a little bit of cold water on myself and just note that we're not done yet. It's not really, we haven't really crossed the finish line and drug it, another 20 yards. We are now putting PFAS compliant water into the system. But there's a lot of work that remains. We'll be back to the board with change orders and other things. There's a whole nother sort of phase that has to happen with more automation of the facility and things like that. So the first part of next year remains the sort of deadline or sort of scheduled target for completion of this, the facility as it stands. But we just couldn't wait to share with the board this really good news.
And because it's not on the agenda, I think that was a great report to give this good news that it's working, and we should probably move on.
We certainly beat the regulatory deadline of 2029.
Yeah. Okay, then I think we're into director's comments. Myself, Director Sethy and Director Weed went on the Region 5 tour, and I don't know if Director Sethy would like to start off on this one with comments.
Well, there's multiple things to report on, but let me tell you, just one aspect of the trip that interests me, and I shared it with Mr. Stevenson. I have come to know the folks in the Pajaro Valley Water District through service on the Region 5 board, and I see that they are using the same amount of acre feet of water a year as our Tri-City area, but primarily for agriculture, around 45,000 acre feet a year. And they have the same saltwater intrusion problems that this district had and has, which they're trying to solve in creative ways. We got to see the recycling plant at their sanitation facility, which primarily goes back to servicing the agricultural properties around there. But I did talk with the general manager extensively over lunch about perhaps taking a visit up here to see our desalination facility, because brackish water desal is certainly an opportunity for that district. Longer term, he agreed that that's probably the solution. They might be the next brackish water facility around the Bay Area, but they don't have the ratepayer base to actually finance something like that right now, because ag water has to be sold at so much lower level. But I will tell you, it was a spectacular day out there. Cool breeze coming in from the ocean. You could smell the salt in the air, and seeing all the workers out in the fields. I don't think we recognize how hard a certain part of our society works to provide our food and fruit on our tables. So it was just a beautiful day out there. So that's my report.
Thank you. We had an excellent presentation on the flood control efforts that they were doing in the Pajaro Valley, and they have a special district they established for that. I found it interesting that they had done an end run on the water bill and got a letter of import, probably through Congressman Panetta. The son is now the local congressman, and proceeded ahead getting Corps of Engineers support for their project. I asked about the effect of the Pacheco Dam, and they kind of give it short shrift, saying, well, there's a small little area over here on the side that might impact the flood control issues in our valley, but did not see it as a major player in their efforts to provide flood control for the Watsonville area. So it was, that was my two main takeaways. Thank you.
It was really an interesting tour to see, and the ag still down there. Some of that came up actually in the presentation about the concept of how we might lose it if we don't watch out. Certainly a lot of effort in their plant that they have. It's a really nice recycled plant. Treatment process is pretty cool. So it was a worthy project to go to. The flood control concept, they've been trying to deal with this for 75 years, I think. And they're finally getting something moving. And maybe even getting some movement on the environmental restrictions to move ahead, or not the CEQA requirements, because it's been 75 years in a disadvantaged community. So I wish them luck down there. It's like a different world.
There were two other things I learned that I found most fascinating. One is, if you read John Steinbeck, you see the stories about the ice factories that for the first time allowed lettuce and fruits and everything and fish to go from the West Coast across the country. Well, the center of the icebox industry or ice making industry was Watsonville. And that's why the railroad yard is so large, and you can still see the buildings and everything where they were making ice. And a story of the ice making from Watsonville is a major exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., of all things. And there were a number of people from Region 5, including me, that grew up reading John Steinbeck novels and came to love Watsonville and the Salinas Valley, and one of my favorite places to go touring on the weekend. And I'd rather go to Salinas for wine tasting than go up to Napa where all the crowds are. But so many people in the room were mentioning the influence that Steinbeck had on their careers.
They're also, they've been there. A lot of those folks down there have been there for a long time.
And there's some remarkable water engineers that are refugees from the city of Watsonville. Thank you.
Worthy tour. Yes, we sat separate. Anything else?
I have a funny story I'd like to say before we go. One of my close friends, Karina Lopez, is on the San Leandro City Council. We've known each other for quite a long time, and she grew up in like a one-bedroom shack on the west side of Salinas Valley in Gonzales. And she was valedictorian from her high school down there and got accepted to Princeton. When she took her first literature class back on the East Coast, the professor asked what kind of novelists they like to read and everything. And she quickly raised her hand and said, John Steinbeck. And the whole class laughed at her like that wasn't a real author on the East Coast. And she said she was ridiculed for the rest of her college career that she was in love with John Steinbeck, but I am too. And Karina is a public servant just like we are, so good friends, good story.
Okay, we've got.
I see 6.2 and 6.3 are both have my name with them. There are a series of webinars on Wednesdays, the 18th to 25th, and again on October 2nd by Aqua, and they're for legal credit. The first one related to general counsel roles. I found it interesting that they did not state, my experience, the primary role of a general counsel was to counsel the board members not to be too expressive on various issues that are coming before them. And the second was easements, and particularly the challenges when you get different public entities involved in a conflicts of easements and their facilities, and who takes precedence. So, thank you.
Thank you. And, well, with that, I believe we've accomplished everything our goals for this evening.
We have one more goal, item 7, adjourn.
That is correct. So with that, I will declare the meeting adjourned.